Good day to you. This is being recorded in the afternoon of September 19th, which is the day of the festivities surrounding the funeral of Queen Elizabeth. And while I promised to stay in my lane and to discuss some international political aspects of this whole business, allow me a few introductory comments. Since the early 1960s, I've spent a substantial amount of time in England doing research or coming back and forth between Africa and England. Having done research, I developed starting in the 80s. I didn't spend months there, but spent 2 or 3 weeks a year there for the better part of 50 years. And I have taken an interest in English politics, primarily because I've always been interested in English colonialism, about which I will talk about in a minute, the current situation. But I have a circle of friends in England, unfortunately now deceased. Most of them were English, a couple were Australian, but lived most of their adult lives in England, and all were staunchly anti-royal. The left of center, progressives, have been anti-royal for some time. And the younger generation in England right now is anti-royal. And in general, there's been opposition to now King Charles for some years. In fact, there have been some good English plays making fun of the royal family and making fun of him in particular. So I just want to have this prologue to tell you a little of my history with it all. Now, those of you listening to me or watching today, I would think fall into two groups. Those of you who think this whole thing has been totally ridiculous, all the paraphernalia and ceremonies around her demise and her funeral, and maybe caught a glimpse on the news. There may be those of you who, for whatever reason, found it interesting and fascinating and watched a whole lot of it. But I think in general, Americans have no particular interest in English royalty and in Queen Elizabeth, although a sufficient number of Americans have sufficient interest to not only go to England as tourists, but to watch the changing of the guard and take their children and maybe even go to Westminster and St. Paul's and go to concerts and so forth. So while we as Americans are sort of anti-royal, we're not interested in any of it, actually a good chunk of Americans have been sort of vaguely fascinated by it all. Now, what has happened in the last few days or since her demise is what the British would call a one-off. There has never been a celebration of this size in England or anywhere else. And most observers feel, and I would agree with them, there never will be again. So in that sense, this spectacular production around her death is probably something that will go down in the history books as something that has never happened before and never will happen again, for a variety of reasons, which I want to discuss in a minute. Quite aside from the spectacular customs and the hundreds of various officialdom marching and everybody knowing where to go and how to march and what to do, neither Hollywood nor any other society in this world is able to produce something like this. So in that sense, it's a remarkable achievement on the part of the English. The folks in Great Britain in general, Scots and so forth, to have produced something like this. On the other hand, it's also the case that the attendees have been unique. In history, at the end of World War II, there were 50-odd independent sovereign countries. You now have more or less 200. of which the heads of state of 100 of these countries were in attendance in these festivities, and almost another 100 sent representatives of one kind or another, ambassadors, vice presidents, and so on. One can, in fact, count on one's hands the countries that were not represented because they were not invited or they're not recognized. Russia being one of them, Belarus being another, Afghanistan, Myanmar, the old Burma, which was a British colony, Venezuela, which hasn't been recognized either. And then there were some questions as to people who would come or not come. For example, the Saudi Arabian Mohammed, was he going to come? Was he not going to come? Because he was charged, of course, in Great Britain because of the death of Khashoggi, the journalist. I don't think he came. I'm not 100% sure. Perhaps somebody from the Saudi Arabian embassy came. So who are these other 100 or so people? As I said, they were ambassadors, representatives. There were interesting things for somebody interested in politics to take note. Originally, it looked like the Chinese would not send anybody. Xi did not come, but a vice president of China came. A smart political move, I would say, on the part of the Chinese. And unusual cast of characters would include, for example, the Emperor and Empress of Japan, who, as our American commentators pointed out, had to get on a bus to get to Westminster Abbey along with other dignitaries. So all kinds of people who were not linked historically to Great Britain, either as colonies or as allies, also showed up, also were invited, also participated in this event. So this is the largest historic event of representatives and ambassadors from the almost 200 countries in the world. The United Nations does not draw this level of participation. They're sometimes heads of state, but certainly not all members send their heads of state to the opening of the General Assembly. So it's an unusual get-together and an unusual show of respect, if you will, interest, not wanting to be left behind for such an occasion. As I said, the magnitude and the size of this has never existed before, and I won't hesitate to say that it will never happen again. And I'll talk about that in a minute. Now, for those of you who listened in at all, one of the things that you heard, both the religious figures and other figures mention the Commonwealth. And it's useful to say a word about the Commonwealth. The Commonwealth is, for all practical purposes, a club that gets together for cultural reasons, sometimes economic reasons. Originally, the Commonwealth, the idea of the Commonwealth was that the former colonies would be members of the Commonwealth. But that's now about 14 members of the Commonwealth. There's a total of 56, and all of the rest of them are not ruled anymore by royalty in England. The Commonwealth countries were mostly English-speaking countries around the world, Asia, Africa, and so forth, who had, cultural, colonial links of one kind or another, even those that decided that they were republics and didn't want the Queen to be the head of their country. But even that has changed. Nowadays, countries that have no historical or colonial links with Great Britain have joined the Commonwealth. For example, the country of Mozambique in East Africa, whose colonial background is Portuguese. Some countries in West Africa have also joined the Commonwealth. So in a sense, it's become a kind of a club that has some benefits. It's no longer only English speaking, but the benefits sometimes also lead to obligations. And let me backtrack to an earlier talk. You may or may not remember that Prime Minister Johnson decided to send asylum seekers who were North Africans and Africans to Rwanda. Rwanda was not an English colony, but is a member of the Commonwealth as well. And they obviously made a deal that Rwanda would take these people. There was strong opposition in England to this move because, for example, Ukrainian asylum seekers are taken by England, so this was considered to be racist. And the current Prime Minister Truss has said that she too will want to send people to Rwanda. And they sit in Rwanda, presumably awaiting asylum. Now, Rwanda is hardly, your democratic country. The head of the Rwandan government is rather authoritarian, to put it mildly. So this is a kind of a controversial issue of the United Kingdom palming off people who are seeking asylum who have at least according to international law, a right to have their asylum processed and sending them offshore, so to speak, to a fellow Commonwealth country. So that's a recent and somewhat interesting development. Now, what was celebrated, of course, was her long life and her steadiness, and I don't need to rehearse all the things that people said in the last days about her wonderful reign of 70 years. But of course, there is a soft underbelly to British colonial history and even contemporary lack of, to put it strongly, apologies or recognition, and certainly no compensation for what British colonialism wrought in various parts of the world. So let me for a moment go to Africa, my neck of the woods, and just give you two examples. One was the Mau Mau rebellion in Kenya, where the Maus were trying to get independence and liberate themselves from English colonialism. And thousands of Mau Maus were killed, were put in concentration camps. It was a bloody and nasty situation. Not surprisingly, even though there's this admiration for Elizabeth's longevity and her steadfastness and so forth, there are lots of people in Kenya who are saying, whoa, they've never apologized for what they've done here. There is a unseemly side to the role of Great Britain in the world. A similar example on the other side of Africa was Nigeria, which, by the way, the Mau Mau rebellion was late 1950s. Kenya became independent, I think, in 1963. In Nigeria, which had, after independence, had a civil war, the so-called Biafran War. Biafra was the Igbo ethnic group, eastern province of Nigeria, which tried to get out from the yoke of A, colonialism, and B, the post-colonial discrimination against that part of Nigeria. And in other words, it was a civil war in Nigeria after Nigerian independence. It happened in the late 60s, early 70s. And the British sent support to the government of Nigeria so that, again, with English help, like Great British help, ammunition, soldiers, and so forth, the civil war and Biafra got defeated and Nigeria stayed whole. You can imagine that there are Nigerians who don't feel very supportive or enthusiastic about the role that England played in their civil war. One more example on the African continent, South Africa. In South Africa, you had, in the late 19th, early 20th century, you had the English and the Boers being the folks who then became known to us as Afrikaners, of Dutch, Swiss, and so forth origin, who developed their own language in South Africa. And then there was the English-speaking, very often included people who migrated or immigrated to South Africa, who identified with the English-speaking population. Some of you may recall that Muhammad Gandhi as a lawyer, went to South Africa to deal with some of the legal situations there, before he returned to India and became what we all see him at the spinning wheel and so forth. So there was a Boer War at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century. And the Boer War was between the Boers and the English speaker, but also England. And again, there were concentration camps, lots of people lost their lives, lots of children died, and so forth. So even though later on the Great Britain supported the anti-racism, anti-Boer regime in England, and then celebrated the coming into being of Mandela, and Mandela was much heralded in England by the Queen. There's a big statue of him on the South Bank in London. There is still a kind of historical side to the English role in South Africa. And I'm just bopping along to give you some illustration. Certainly in South Asia, Malaysia, Burma, and so forth, you can tell tales again of the sort of miserable colonial regime of England. Now, one of the things, of course, that the English say is, well, colonialism is dead. It's too bad there was colonialism. It's too bad even that there was slavery, and that the English enslaved so many people, and that the population of the Caribbean islands that are English speaking or were English colonies or are still under the auspices, at least theoretically, under the royalty in England, that this is a historical period, and nowadays nobody views colonialism or what was done in the name of colonialism favorably. That's all true. What is also true, and this is a discussion that many have in the United Kingdom, even though they decided maybe to go watch the proceedings of the last day, is that the United Kingdom, England, should apologize. Right. And there are very strong feelings on the part of the anti-royalists, and there are very critical feelings about the Queen, who, of course, was not meant to and never got involved in politics, but whether she should have said something about the history of colonialism, and in some ways apologize, or at least recognize what happened under her predecessors, but also under her reign still. Many people fault her for that, and fault British royalty for having sort of sidestepped that whole issue. So there are, serious international political repercussions to English royalty and even Queen Elizabeth, for on the one hand, having done so much for the reputation of the royal palace and the steadiness and the sort of bringing people in England together, especially during these times of funerals. But at the same time, there are quite a lot of people in the world, even those that have representatives and heads of state there, right there at the funeral, who are saying, really, shouldn't somebody have said a little bit more and apologized in some ways? Or more to the point of the kinds of things the Kenyans and the Caribbeans are saying, being attentive possibly to some reparations. Now, of course, we in the United States can hardly stand on a high pedestal because, as we know, we've also had the conversation as to whether or not, because of slavery, people who are the descendants of slaves are owed some reparations. And that's a separate and complicated argument, both for the English and for the United States. But even if you haven't worked out reparations, to at least address the harm you have done and not pretend that none of it exists might have been something that the Queen might have done and the palace might have done in one way or another. So she is faulted around the world. On the one hand, respected about her steadfastness and her generosity on a one-to-one basis. I mean, she was always willing to meet and shake hands with representatives of former colonies, white, black, or brown. But at the same time, that was not the same as a kind of indication and recognition that something more was necessary. And that has played into domestic English politics, but has also played into what we're about to face in international politics. Namely, that some of the countries that are still consider her the head of state, that she is still the queen of, are actually wanting to get out from under. Australia, for example, New Zealand, some of the countries in the Caribbean, some of the islands in the Caribbean and elsewhere have made it known that they wish to become republics. In other words, the figurehead of the queen and now the king is something that they want to get rid of. And that debate was muted, obviously, during these funeral proceedings, but it's still very much alive. And when the Prime Minister of New Zealand and Australia was asked about this in the last couple of days, they sort of tried to brush it away and saying, this is not the time to discuss it, somewhere down the road. And I bet anything that somewhere down the road, most of these countries would declare themselves as republics, and the Queen will no longer be the figurehead of the countries, which only really means that the Commonwealth will stay as the Commonwealth. More countries will join. These former colonies, which still had the Queen as their nominal head, will become republics, but they will stay in the Commonwealth. And the Commonwealth is a useful instrument. It's not an economic treaty. It's not, anything that has very major legal teeth, either in the domestic or international affairs, but it's a useful mechanism. And it just goes to show that a certain amount of interdependence across the world, across different parts of the world, across very different countries, can be useful, and can be useful as talking shops, educational exchanges, some economic perks, people speaking the same language in many ways. It is a useful mechanism. And while we're in an age of wanting, right-wing and left-wing politicians in various countries wanting to argue independence, no interdependence, global governance is a bad thing, one of the things that the Commonwealth has going for it is that it is one of these institutions which doesn't cost countries a lot, but helps with a certain amount of interdependence. And often conflict and difficulties can be avoided if people are simply talking to each other in international affairs. Not surprising, therefore, that through these funeral proceedings, It hasn't just been praising her reign and praising, her family, and praising various aspects of the royal court, but also both the ministers and the non-religious figures. Almost everybody has mentioned the Commonwealth as being part of the enterprise, and I actually think that is a good thing for both for England, for Great Britain, even if, for example, Scotland separates itself down the road, some point becomes independent, continuing to be a member of the Commonwealth is probably a good thing. Now, I don't want to exaggerate here. The Commonwealth is nothing like the European Union, which has real teeth, legal and economic content, but it is a talking shop, and talking shops sometimes are useful. And you can see that the countries that were not participating in these events, for example, Russia, for example, Venezuela, are doing that as a loss internationally to themselves with other countries. So this has political relevance. This is not just ceremony. This is not just, sort of airy-fairy stuff. This has actual and potential repercussions in international diplomacy, which is very much part of world affairs and affairs running smoothly, and will increasingly, it seems to me, take on some additional aspects, which is as people increasingly have to migrate because of climate change and instability and the need for workers and all the rest that we've discussed before and we will discuss again. All of these things means that the populations of this world will become more mixed up than they are even today. All countries will have people from other societies and other cultures, other races. And under those circumstances, being knit together in something called the Commonwealth, or, you can make sort of a joke out of it and saying everybody in the Commonwealth has something in common, namely they all drink tea. But drinking tea, speaking English, having some anchors that are collective and some history of collective, I think is really important. Of course, the flip side, which I got through discussing, which is that should there be reparations for the people that have really suffered under English colonialism, I think is a separate issue. Now, some of the issues I've discussed in the last 15 minutes were not at the forefront as long as Elizabeth was alive, because her age, the fact that she was respected, that she was gracious, and so forth, in general led people to mute their desires, their desires to have the colonial history addressed somewhat. Her graciousness to representatives from all these countries kind of papered over the fact that those societies and the politicians wished that the United Kingdom would step up to the plate and not only acknowledge but apologize and maybe give some additional economic perks in reparations to those countries. So all of that got muted in recent years. The much less respected Prince Charles may have a harder time dealing with it. And I think that most observers who are critical of the royal household and family not only criticize the incredible cost to English society of maintaining what we have just witnessed, but maintaining the courts and all the rest, but have also lack of faith that either Prince Charles or the subsequent King William will be anything other than much more muted and not really be the actor on the stage that their mother was. So while on the one hand, we've had a lot of ceremony and a lot of visuals, I think it's worth bearing in mind that we're talking upward of, well, let's say close to 200 countries who've been present during these celebrations of her life, and that the role of England as a coherent country, maybe Great Britain even, a culture, a place with a history, a place that is not just negative and evil historically, but in its present form has some cohesion as a society, I think has been noted and is not unimportant, which is why so many hundreds of thousands of English people have lined the streets, many of them not very pro-royal, but many of them in a sense wanting to celebrate their Englishness and their cohesiveness with that society. That is not a bad thing, even in England, because England too has a fairly right-wing government. It has people who are very alienated from the society. It has very many anti-immigrant groups and so forth. So to try to think through why it is sometimes important to have a collective sense of your culture and your society, and to live with that for a couple of days is probably not a bad antidote to the kind of separatist politics, racial separatism, and all the serious problems which lie ahead and which have been papered over in the last couple of days. But I'd just like to end by saying it's all possible to look at all of this thinking, oh, this is just a bunch of Hollywood garbage. But I wanted to try to convince you that there are many aspects that are past, present, and future that are quite political and that will play a major role in the international world that we live in. Thank you very much for listening today.